All right. Well, thank you for coming tonight. Welcome to the last lecture in this series this summer, Summer Fever, of the 2011 Hertog Global Strategy Initiative. So I'd like to thank, as I always do, Roger Hertog and the Hertog Foundation for making all this possible. I want to also thank the Mailman School of Public Health, both the Center for the History and Ethics of Public Health, but also I want to thank the Communications Department for all of their support. I want to thank as well, since this is the last lecture, all of those who have been helping all along to make all of this possible, and that especially is the case with Sydney Gross. Thank you so much, Sydney. So if you've been coming to these lectures, you know that these lectures are a part of a larger program. It includes a research program. There's a seminar. There are elective courses. There's a lot that we're trying to do to pack in every summer, and so we've drawn on the talents of many others as well. So I want to also thank Will Leonard, if he's here. Thank you so much, Will. I want to thank Lydia Walker. Who's also played a key role. Thank you, Lydia. And I also want to thank Andrew and Chang and Amina, the interns who've joined us later in the summer, but have volunteered their time and their talents and their intelligence, and in all these ways made this program better than it might have been. So thank you again. The idea behind this program is that we're trying to take on problems that are transnational in nature and global in scope. And we're trying to see whether it's possible to do historical research on some of the most pressing problems in world politics, and think, too, about how it is history might help us to plan for and prepare for these challenges. So this is a program that, while it's historical in nature in the sense of the kind of research we do, the archives we go to, the interviews we conduct, the kinds of people who come to us and tell us about what they've learned over the course of their careers and the research that they've done, it's also one that tries to bring in people from different disciplines to help us as historians better understand the nature of these kinds of problems. Last year was nuclear proliferation. This summer it's on pandemics and public health. Next summer we'll be looking at religious violence and apocalyptic movements. So we're taking on some of the biggest problems in world politics. We're trying to do basic research, and we're trying to do it in a way that's actually relevant and maybe even useful for thinking about these problems and trying to do something about them. So in bringing people together, we're also bringing together undergraduates and graduate students. Undergraduates are doing very advanced research, as I've been hearing and as others of you already know over the last 3 days in the presentations that they've done. And graduate students as well, who I think in part because it's the summertime and all the adults are away, including their advisors, they're able to ask questions that in some ways maybe are bigger and bolder than they've been trained to take on in the course of doing, say, a dissertation. They're doing all that in the course of a summer instead of in 6 years, and I assure you the results, as you'll be seeing in the publications that they will produce, I think have been quite exciting. But let me welcome Allan Brandt in particular and thank him for coming, because in many ways the work that he's done has been a model for many of us in this program, not only in the path-breaking and incredibly important books that he's written in the Cigarette Century and also in No Magic Bullet, but asking very basic questions about how we understand agenda setting in public health, how it is that problems in public health help to create a prism by which we can better understand society. But also because of the kind of the ways in which he's used this research to inform public debates on the most important issues of life and death for millions of people. For instance, in the way that he testified for the U.S. Department of Justice in the U.S. versus Philip Morris, and in many other ways that I won't tell you about, and he would be too modest to tell you about, but which you can read about if you just begin to research Allan Brandt. And then finally, as the Dean of the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences at Harvard, Allan, as he's been telling us, has been doing really exciting things in graduate education. And I want to thank him, too, for talking to our students about some of those things and helping them think critically, as we all must, about the history and future of public education and higher education in the United States. So in all these ways, I want to thank Allan, and I want to thank him, too, for preparing this exciting lecture on history, health, and global governance, the case of the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. So thank you again, Allan.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Conley, and for such a great introduction. And I want to thank you and Professor Morse, and especially Sydney Gross, for inviting me and having me here today. When I got the invitation from you in the spring, I have to say, as I read about the program, I got excited right away, because these are the questions that have been so essential to me personally about how we find a usable past, how to think about the history of contemporary problems, how to try to do serious scholarship, but scholarship that also is related to crucial questions of the present and the future. And I just have to say, getting to talk with the students who participated in the program this summer, you know, how excited I am for the kinds of work that you're doing. It's really a remarkable program. And it has all the right values, because I'm somebody who believes in knowledge for knowledge's sake. But at the same time, I'm also somebody who believes that the kind of work we can do in our scholarship can really be related to the most powerful moral and cultural, political questions of our time, and figuring out how to do that in a way that really has rigor and is done in a systematic way, something I'm still struggling with. So what I thought I would do is tell you about a problem that I struggled with in my recent work on tobacco. And I think it will raise a lot of questions about things that you've been studying all summer, and maybe we can have a broader conversation about some of those questions. We just came from a smaller seminar, and I was explaining when I came to Columbia to do my graduate work in 1975, I thought I would work on comparative questions across nations, and I was immediately told either you're an Americanist or you're a Europeanist. And a lot of American history has centered on the question of how is America so different? And I have to say, unfortunately, that's the tradition in which I was taught. And Americanists really worked on America as if it was unconnected from the world. And so many of the questions at stake in thinking about global history mean placing America within a broad global context in the kinds of transnational exchanges that Professor Conley just mentioned. And that's really the theme that I want to take up today. But I have to admit, even when I started my book on cigarette smoking, I really thought I was going to write a history of cigarette smoking in American life, and that I would trace a rather remarkable story of how cigarette smoking came to be so popular in the United States, and then ultimately about its relative decline in the last 2 or 3 decades. And I thought that was a great story. For the most part, smoking doesn't exist as we know it. As recently as 1900, there was this phenomenal rise of cigarette smoking during the course of the 20th century in the United States. And then a very good story for public health, that a behavior that's highly addictive, that's intensely advertised, and so on, actually declines in number over a series of decades, that would be sort of beginning, middle, and end. And that's really where I started. I just thought I would briefly review some of the questions that were at stake in this. This is just a chart that shows the rise of male smoking, very intense in the first decade of the 20th century, often associated with World War I. The Women's Christian Temperance Union opposed smoking and said, now that we've banned alcohol, we'll ban smoking. But by the end of the First World War, the Women's Christian Temperance Union is distributing cigarettes to the troops. So there's a profound social and cultural change that takes place during the war, tremendous rise in men's smoking, and then followed about a 20-year lag in women's smoking, almost getting to the rates in which men smoke. And this was really the chart that I began my project with. I wanted to explain this, and I thought there are so many important questions to American social, cultural historians, historians of medicine and public health, that would be my project. But it turned out not exactly to be the case. But what I thought I would do is just quickly show you sort of some of the factors that led to that rise in cigarette smoking, and just mention it. Because I always had the notion that if we could understand why cigarette smoking got to be so popular in the United States, you would recover some of the mechanisms for undoing that behavior. That there was almost perhaps a form of reverse engineering in a historical project like this, that to really understand what types of public health interventions might be most effective today around smoking, you really had to understand how its appeal was built up in the early years of the 20th century. There are many aspects to this, changes in business and business organization that I describe in my book, changes in technology and the mass production of cigarettes. People went from rolling several hundred a day to machines that could roll hundreds of thousands in an hour, and then how do you mass market a product that you can produce so easily and cheaply. But branding was a critical aspect, and the emergence of national brands is at the heart of consumer cultures, and Camel's was one of the first major brands. These ads are from right around the time of the First World War. One of the big issues that the chart that I showed you already raises is men started smoking, but there was a widespread perception in American culture in the first decades of the 20th century that it was not appropriate for women to smoke. So the companies realized we've only got half the market. And so how are we going to change cultural norms to think about getting women to smoke when there are serious moral, social, and cultural prescriptions about women smoking, and especially women smoking in public? The reason I want to raise this so clearly now is that when we look at smoking globally today, smoking is principally around the world a male behavior. And I know what that means to the tobacco industry. It means we're missing major segments of the market. And they had a specific strategy in the United States to getting women to smoke in these early decades of the 20th century that now we're seeing deployed again in very culturally, nationally, and historically specific ways. One of the ways they did it here is they said, well, we can't really advertise directly to women, so let's have these ads that say, have a woman saying, blow some my way. These ads are from 1928, and right away, Chesterfield became the most popular cigarette among women smokers. American Tobacco hired this very brilliant public relations expert on your left, Edward Bernays. And he actually hired debutantes to smoke in the 1928 Easter Day Parade in New York. And Bernays is really a fascinating figure in the history of consumer cultures. And his papers are at the Library of Congress in Washington. And so when I started this project, I went down there and they said, well, his papers won't become available until he dies. And I said, well, how old is he? And they said, well, he's 98. So I waited and I waited. And historians can be quite ghoulish in this way. And Bernays died at 103. And the next day I was at the National Archives. And what I found was really curious is that he had collected scrapbooks with newspaper articles. And I kept asking myself the question that a historian should about documents. Why is he collecting these scrapbooks of newspaper articles? Because he did not want to identify that he had been involved in the production of these news stories. But what he wanted to do was to create news and then document it. The way he could demonstrate this for his client, in this instance, American Tobacco, was by collecting all the news clippings. And at the time, there were news clipping services. Many of you who have worked in archives have seen these kinds of collections. He documented that when he got the debutantes to smoke Lucky Strikes on Fifth Avenue at the 1928 parade, he made sure that there were news photographers there to do it. And he said, controversy, this will create women smokers, women smoking in public. He associated it with feminism and women's liberation at the moment, and it was all incredibly effective. You see this ad on your right, I really don't know if I should smoke, but my brothers and my sweetheart smoke, and it does give me a lot of pleasure. There's a transformation at this moment in American culture about the idea that pleasure is indulgent and wrong to actually creating a pleasure-oriented economy where it says indulge in a Lucky Strike, the most pleasurable cigarette. And I noticed this transformation in American culture around items like the cigarette at this time. These are ads that were Bernays ads. Do you inhale? Everybody's doing it. 7 out of 10 smokers inhale knowingly. The other 5 inhale unknowingly. The use of sexuality to sell products seems apparent here. Some of my students think that these are sexually suggestive. I don't see it myself. These were actually drawn by a famous pinup artist of the 1930s. But by this time, women and men are smoking equally. It's seen as a sign of relations between men and women. Smoking becomes very popular in American film. One of the questions I got all the time as I was beginning this project was, does the smoking you see in American film as a visual representation reflect changes in the culture? Don't you see smoking in film because more people were smoking? But when we get into the tobacco documents, you see that Bernays was working with Hollywood directors and with major film companies to assure that they used cigarettes in their film. So the relationship between film as a cultural idiom and force and industrial interest is much more complex than simply seeing it as a mirror of changing culture. So the other thing that became so apparent during this period of the rise of cigarettes is that cigarettes turned out to be extremely dangerous. And so one of the things that I have studied is the rise of the science of epidemiology as it was reflected in the cigarette. Some of my friends have said you don't need to be an epidemiologist to see the causal relationship here. But what I want to suggest is as early as the 1930s and 40s, when people became very concerned about cancers and tobacco, this relationship would have been much more difficult to unpack. And so the very early years of epidemiologists looking at this question looks like this. And so one of the things we know about tobacco is that the knowledge in certain disciplines that evolved were crucial to the determination of evidence-based notions of causality and disease, which is critical to so many material questions in global health. And so I don't have time to go into the detail now, but the early evolution of retrospective and then prospective trials to unpack this particular question is a crucial element of mid-20th century science and the development of epidemiology as a field. And I like showing this slide when I teach in schools of public health, because it really puts you back in a moment where some of the tools that we use just normally now weren't always available. And how do you understand this question? You see a small rise in disease, but is it caused by the rise in automobiles, the paving of roads, which is highly toxic, the development of cigarette smoking, which is a major popular behavior, or some other variable? And understanding, I think, epidemiology at that level is crucial to thinking about the skill set that's really needed to unpack very complicated problems of causality. Here's how the tobacco industry responded to scientific knowledge. More doctors smoke Camels than any other brand. When I testified against the tobacco industry in the case that Matt mentioned, I had found out that actually what they were doing is they would go to medical meetings and put Camel cigarettes in the doctor's rooms. Then they would have a pollster in the lobby, and the pollster would say, "Doctor, what cigarette brand are you carrying?" And they'd fish out this free pack of Camels, and then they said, "More doctors smoke Camels than any other brand." And I was telling this story at the trial, and like 30 tobacco lawyers got up all at one time and said, "We object. We're stipulating this story. We don't want to hear it." So I thought it was a pretty good story. The other types of responses were to say, filter cigarettes, or our cigarettes don't really cause disease. And the reason I show these slides in this context is a lot of these issues are persistent. Safer brands, ultralights, a lot of issues that have been very difficult from a public health point of view really have their origins in the 50s around the definitive evidence that smoking causes lung cancer. What the companies did is they put out this statement that, again, was planned by public relations people that said, we've always been committed to public health. We want to get to the bottom of this. There's a great deal of scientific uncertainty around the problem of cigarette smoking. Rely on us to get to the bottom of this. And so this remains part of the strategic orientation that I'll describe more about the tobacco industry in a global context. Finally, the Surgeon General of the United States in 1964 came forward and said, cigarette smoking causes lung cancer. And it really required the state, and one of the questions that we want to ask, I think, when we're thinking about global health is, what is the appropriate role of the state? In this instance, the state adjudicated a controversy that had been invented by the industry, and the state was recognized as a neutral player in the resolution of that dispute, even though the industry would be deeply committed to undermining the findings of the first Surgeon General's report, often through political lobbying. The first label on cigarettes after Surgeon General Terry makes his announcement that cigarette smoking causes lung cancer was a label that the industry wanted on cigarettes that said cigarette smoking may be hazardous to your health. Now, why did the industry want that on the package? It was viewed as a public health intervention because then they could say, cigarettes are labeled, you're aware that they may be harmful, and the decision is yours, so you cannot hold our companies responsible. So there's a very ambiguous history to labeling in which we think of it as a public health intervention, but in this instance, it very much served the interests of the tobacco industry. And I'll say a bit more about that a little bit later on. So here we have this chart, and I have to say, in my American exceptionalist orientation, I view this chart with some degree of gratification that cigarette smoking had grown tremendously. I thought I had some explanations for why that was the case and that I understood it better as I conducted my study. And I began to understand why cigarette smoking had declined modestly but significantly, given its biologically and socially and culturally addictive qualities. And I thought, this is a good story for public health where you identify health risks, even in the face of powerful industrial interests, and yet you create a society that begins to modify it. And we went from, as you see, almost 60% of men. I recently saw a data point that in medical schools in the mid-1960s, nearly 80% of all medical students were regular smokers. Imagine that today. And yet today we see these dramatic declines. In medical schools, you would have fewer than 1% of medical students are smokers today. So it was a good story. But here's my point in the context of thinking about global health. This good story of American public health and the nature of what we understand about tobacco has had dramatic implications for global health. And so we need to think about this story in a much more complicated way, because one of the things I think it will teach us is that an intervention that may be successful in one nation state has all kinds of very serious implications for other nations and for indices of global health. And that's really where I want to take off today. So one of the questions that I think we really need to ask when we tell a story of success in public health is what were its ramifications in terms of some of the transnational and relational issues that are really at the core of how to think about global health. And one of the big problems that we have right now is how are we going to define global health? Is it just everything that happens relating to health on the globe? Or can we be somewhat more specific about the kinds of human and disease interactions and movement that actually crosses societies and states in ways that might be informed by different types of public policies? And that's at the heart of what I really want to discuss. What the companies realized, and they realized it early on, was that what was happening in the United States and the growing awareness of tobacco as the principal public health risk that Americans were experiencing made them think about other markets. And I have to think that the tobacco industry has been remarkably intelligent and sophisticated about the overall decline in American smoking that they anticipated as early as the 1970s. And they began to aggressively think about where are other markets that will create what they refer to in their own documents as replacement smokers. They said American smokers are quitting or they're dying. And if we are going to sustain our industry, we need new smokers. And where will new smokers come from? They'll either come from kids today in the United States and other Western developed countries who don't smoke. But given the levels of affluence and education and the public health campaigns, and especially the campaigns about side stream smoke that became so important by the 70s and 80s, the United States market, the Western European market, the Australian and Canadian markets, for example, are all going to be compromised. So where is the future of our product? and it was really in the developing world. And so this, in a way, is the problem. In the year 2000, approximately 4 million people died of tobacco-related diseases worldwide. And half of them were in the developed world, and half of them were in the developing world, low-income and some middle-income countries. And by the year 2030, now only less than 2 decades from now, the number of total deaths will go from 4 million to 10 million. It will more than double. But those deaths will occur predominantly, very significantly, 70% of those deaths will now occur in the developing world. And this is the material representation of a tobacco industry strategy that was really hatched in the 60s and 70s in terms of finding new smokers and aggressively promoting smoking in places that had lower levels of literacy and education, which had weaker state governments, which had no regulatory regimes, and I'll say a bit more about that. I don't know if you've used these maps in the course. Have you used some of these? These are really fascinating maps, and I highly recommend that you go on this website. It's called worldmapper.org. And these come from the University of Sheffield in England. But a cartographer there, working with a physicist from the United States, worked out a distortion map in which you could enter a single variable and distort landmass by that variable. And so they have literally hundreds of these maps on the website: maternal mortality, education, a lot of health outcomes, a lot of social indicators, and they put in one variable and then the map distorts. And what this does is it really tells you where that variable is most active at any one time. I have to say, this was surprising to me, and I'd been studying tobacco for a long time, to realize that there's so much smoking going on in Russia and the former Soviet Union, in India and Southeast Asia, and just how reduced smoking is in North America, how it has not been so predominant in Latin America. And you know, I feel in my work I've gotten inside the head of the tobacco industry. And as I say, they're very sophisticated. They see this map and they say, what are some of the opportunities on this map? And a giant opportunity is Africa and Latin America, where individuals tend to be less well educated and in which you can create a new market given, you know, consumer economies. So it's pretty impressive. Here it is for women. And so you can see there are many places that for men have tremendous numbers of smokers, but look at the difference between India or the Russian states on this. And you see that is an opportunity. And what I learned in my study is if you're a tobacco executive and you're thinking, where's our weakness? It's on women smokers in India. Then they become very sophisticated and they know a lot about this. And they actually did this in the United States in the 1920s. And what are the associations of getting women to smoke? They're around gender equality, women in the workplace, women as attractive and glamorous. So a lot of the building blocks for addressing this from, if you will, the dark side are really expressed in these material maps. And you can learn a lot from these maps very quickly. Here's what's been happening. Smoking is on the decline in the US and the UK. It's been on a very steep incline in China. The great British epidemiologist Richard Peto did a major study of the epidemiology of smoking and smoking's harms in China. He said if the Chinese smoke like the American and the British, they'll die like the American and the British. And this is an enormous problem for the healthcare system in China, but it's also indicative of some of the questions that I want to raise about markets and commerce from a global perspective. Here you see tobacco-related deaths per year, and China by 2040 will eclipse all of the developed nations in terms of numbers of deaths. That's an evolving healthcare system. How will putting this number of chronic related diseases that we associate with smoking into that system impact the emerging Chinese economy in the middle of the 21st century. I think this is a very clever illustration, so I wanted to share it with you. This is from Alan Lopez, and what he's done is has put various areas of the world into different stages of what he would call tobacco epidemics or the tobacco pandemics. And so you see Western Europe, the United Kingdom, the US, Canada, and Australia having declining smoking rates, and they're in the fourth stage after very significant rises in the middle of this chart. Eastern Europe and Southern Europe have plateaued, Latin America, but Sub-Saharan Africa, China, Japan, Southeast Asia are really steeply rising. And so you can, in a way, develop some periods of this epidemic. But one of the things this raises for us is there something that we could learn from what the Western European or American history of the epidemic that we could guide back into stage 1 and stage 2 countries so that they would have stronger tools to resist this rise of smoking? And so these are some of the questions of governance that I think we get into in policy, is what do we know from our experience in the West that might be utilized effectively in other places of the world at this time? And it's that transferal of knowledge that's a critical aspect of globalization as well. This has tremendous implications for the overall burden of disease. And I don't know how much some of you have spent on overall concepts of the burden of disease and how it's measured, but it's a critical element. And we've actually made a lot of progress in coming to more consensual measures about the burden of disease in societies in the last 20 years. But what I wanted to suggest by this complicated slide, which I'll try to explain, is that in developing countries, the predominant aspect of the burden of disease have become non-communicable diseases. And so we're dealing in the West with systemic chronic diseases, heart disease, the diseases associated with obesity, the cancers that are a very significant component of our burden of disease, with a minority of disease outcomes impacted by infection. In the developing world, they're still dealing with fundamental epidemics of infectious diseases. Tuberculosis and malaria tend to be highly prevalent. What this will do in those countries is that rather than having what we call a traditional health transition, which we saw in most Western countries, from periods of epidemic infectious diseases to systemic chronic diseases, they will have a simultaneous burden of infectious disease and systemic chronic diseases for those who survive infectious disease. And this double burden, this double jeopardy, will have a tremendous impact on the health systems of developing countries that are often resource poor when it comes to developing access to health services. So the changes in the use of tobacco will severely impact developed countries. Here's what's going on now. As many of you know, Altria, or Philip Morris USA, was split from Philip Morris International. And Philip Morris Altria sales, even though its profits are increasing, its sales are essentially flat in the West. But this is the numbers of cigarettes that Philip Morris International is manufacturing and selling now. So the entire shift of this industry has gone from the West to the developing countries in the most dramatic ways in a relatively brief period of time. So there is a tremendous potential for a colossal epidemic of tobacco-related diseases. One of the things we know about tobacco is, unlike so many other risky, harmful substances, it causes so many different diseases and so much morbidity. So it is just a highly toxic product that has so many negative health outcomes and no benefit on the other side. There are some risks that at least have some potential benefits on the other side. This is what the global market share of tobacco looks like now. Obviously, the China tobacco monopoly continues to produce a tremendous number of cigarettes and sell them. But here you see British American Tobacco and Philip Morris are together much more significant than even the China national tobacco monopoly. What the tobacco companies have been doing in places like this ad in Nigeria are finding ways to aggressively promote cigarettes in countries that are highly vulnerable to initial sales and initiation of tobacco. And you see here, one of the things they did at this event is they lit cigarettes and gave them to people coming to the movies. One of the things they've done at a lot of discotheques in Southeast Asia is you need to return empty packages in order to get access to the discotheque. So these are practices that obviously, you know, if people tried them in New York City now would be illegal, but there's a regulatory map, you might say, that the industry has, and they're looking for countries where regulatory processes are at their very most limited. These are ads, let me tell you where these come from. 1 second, sorry. These are from Senegal, Kenya, and Nigeria. These are all either British American or Philip Morris products. This is the kind of advertising you see in Ukraine on the upper left, Pakistan, China, Senegal, and Cambodia. Now this is very interesting. These are photographs from Thailand, and Thailand banned cigarette advertising in 1988, and it's still banned there. So what do? They do what is often called brand stretching. And these brands are well known internationally. They're on the internet, they've been on the web. And so while they're not selling cigarettes, they promote the brand through other logos on t-shirts, sports paraphernalia, water bottles, canteens. And for a while I was collecting this stuff. Like I had hats from race cars, and I was afraid somebody would come to my house and think I worked for the tobacco industry. But this was a very interesting thing. The Thais actually developed a very robust anti-tobacco policy. And they had very high tariffs on Western tobacco products, as did Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan in the 1980s. And so there was this question, you know, were these in restraint of trade? Did they violate World Trade Organization, at that time known as GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade? And the Thais were very aggressive about it, and the American tobacco industry went to the US trade representatives. This was in the late Reagan administration, the first Bush 1 administration, and they said, these countries have illegal tariffs that are restricting the sale of our products. And this was also the time that Surgeon General Koop was mounting the most aggressive effort in United States history against big tobacco. So here you have the American government, on the one hand, getting really behind side stream smoke, restricting smoking in public places. One of Koop's major Surgeon General's report was on smoking as addiction. In a press conference, he said smoking is more addictive than heroin and cocaine. And so he's a major critic of the tobacco industry, much feared by big tobacco. At the same time, the US trade representatives for the United States are going to Japan, Thailand, Korea, and Taiwan and saying, you must open your market to American tobacco products. And so what happened? The Japanese, the Taiwanese, and the South Koreans were forced by threats of American trade boycotts to open their markets to American products. And what happens when you open your trade to American products? You increase competition, you increase advertising. In Japan, cigarettes before this tariff change were the 40th most advertised product. And after the fall in the tariff and the introduction of American brands in Japan, they became the second most advertised product in Japan. And what happens when you have that kind of intensive advertising and competition? tobacco consumption went up. In Japan, it went up by 10% within a year. It especially went up among women smokers. In Japan, very few women were smoking in the mid to late 1980s. Well, what did the tides do? This was a really fascinating story. In Thailand, where there had been a local indigenous tobacco control movement, they said, we're not raising our tariff, we refuse to do it. And so what happens in these kinds of trade disputes? It goes to a court in Geneva where it's adjudicated by the General Agreement on Tariffs of Trade or the World Trade Organization. And so the Thai said, we have this tariff on Western products because it's a public health tariff. And there's less smoking in Thailand because we restrict trade in American tobacco products. And they got the World Health Organization to come and testify on their behalf. And there's actually a codicil in the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade known as 20B, which says that you can restrict trade by tariffs for public health reasons. So they cited this 20B rule in their presentation before the trade court in Geneva. But the American representative said this is straight out a restraint on American trade. They can have public health processes if they want, but they should appeal equally to American and Thai-produced tobacco products. And what did the court decide? The court decided that they must open their trade to American tobacco products. And it's very interesting. The 20B rule has three levels. One is that it must be necessary for public health if you did it. So you might satisfy that when you say it's a public health mechanism. And the World Health Organization got behind the ties. Then you have to identify that it's the least restrictive possible measure for accomplishing that goal. Harder to demonstrate. And then the third thing is you have to say, if you do have a tariff on tobacco, you must be able to show that it's an effective public health policy. Also very difficult. So those three rules are in the interest of trade over public health. But so the Thais were actually forced to open their markets. They were permitted by the decision of the trade court to continue to ban advertising, which was in a way a victory for public health. But this has been the strategy for the companies to undermine the ban on tobacco advertising. But this is my key point here, is that if we're going to understand health risks in a global context, they must be understood in the context of our trade agreements and trade issues. And I don't know if anybody here has been studying generic drugs and HIV, but the very same rules that in a way have been significant in restricting public health interventions for tobacco have also been utilized to restrict access to essential medications. So the relationship of public health to trade in a global context is going to be one of the critical areas of investigation as we move forward. Here's what Surgeon General Koop said about this. He wasn't allowed to come to any of the meetings with the U.S. trade representatives, and he was pretty outraged. He said, I feel the most shameful thing that this country did was to export disease, disability, and death by selling our cigarettes to the world. What the companies did was shocking, but even more appalling was the fact that our own government helped make it possible. And here you have like the government acting in completely distinct ways domestically and in terms of global interactions. Here's what Philip Morris said. In any event, despite the lingering tobacco liability cases and the drop in cigarette consumption in the United States, the tobacco companies themselves have never been healthier, in part because of the lift of these tariffs. First, foreign consumption of American cigarettes continues to grow dramatically because of the falling value of the dollar, a reduction in tariff and non-tariff barriers to cigarettes, and the image of American cigarettes as the best in terms of quality and character. Japan is now importing U.S. cigarettes, and China shows great potential. I did a little math just to figure out about American tobacco consumption had fallen from 60% or 50% to about 20%, which is about where it stands today. And I asked myself, what percentage of the Chinese market would you need to replace all the American smokers who had died or quit? and it was about 2 to 3% of the Chinese market. So you can see, just a foothold in the Chinese market completely puts the companies back beyond where they were when they were principally selling tobacco domestically. Here's another Philip Morris quote. Demographically, the population explosion in many underdeveloped countries ensures a large potential market for cigarettes. Culturally, demand will increase with the continuing emancipation of women and the linkage in the minds of many consumers of smoking manufactured cigarettes with modernization, sophistication, wealth, and success, a connection encouraged by much of the advertising for cigarettes throughout the world. So you could rely on the historical meanings that had been invented for domestic American tobacco throughout the world. Politically, increased cigarette sales can bring benefits to the government of an underdeveloped country that are hard to resist. And one of the things we find about this period of the last 20 years of the 20th century is that health ministers would go to cabinet meetings and say, we must control the introduction of Western tobacco into our countries. And the economic ministers would say, we need these funds now for the good of our population in terms of their immediate health care, infrastructural needs, and so on. So you see enormous tensions within developing world governments about the role and character of tobacco profits. This is a model that a colleague of mine developed, Julius Richmond, who was Surgeon General during the Carter administration, very brilliant sort of theorist of public health. And he said, to develop strong public health policies, you need to have a strong social strategy, a political will, and a strong knowledge base. And I thought I would introduce this here because I think it gets at three of the critical components that any historical or sociological public health analysis would need to make of the introduction of effective public health policies. Nothing would have happened in the US in terms of reducing smoking if there hadn't been this excellent scientific knowledge base about the harms of smoking. And yet, if you only had the knowledge base and you didn't have a social strategy for its deployment or the political will for its application, you still don't get where you need to go. So what Richmond was very interested in was, what's the relationship of these three components? I think it's been very interesting to watch this in the United States. People said in the 1960s and 70s, smoking is your own fault if you do it. So essentially the company said, we're free and clear. We've told everybody, we put it on the label, and so if somebody smokes now and they get sick, it's their responsibility. So some of the social strategists in the public health campaign against tobacco in the United States said, but what if we could show that your smoke is harmful to me? Then we would change the calculus of public health regulation in a fairly radical way. So what did that social strategy require? That social strategy required more science about the harms of secondhand smoke, which then created political will to regulate public spaces. So I think that you can try this around different types of issues, but you begin to see the relationship of these components in thinking about public health interventions and possibly public health governance. So the question might be, what's the use of law in global public health? What's the quality of the knowledge base overall? Is there political will to modify the trade in tobacco, which has been such a dominant aspect of tobacco commerce and its implications for the burden of disease? And this is what began to happen in the early 21st century. And a group of lawyers had the idea, they were reviewing the World Health Organization Charter, and one of the things in the charter, it said, is the World Health Organization has the authority to make treaties. And it was now 2003, 2004, the World Health Organization had never developed a treaty for public health. But treaties were becoming important in certain kinds of transnational exchange, and in which there were perceived to be very significant supranational interests that could not be moderated or affected by a single nation state. And so there was a model of protocols, what were called framework conventions, treaties, around certain kinds of environmental harms. And there was this idea in countries, what if we decided we would have great environmental policy, but the country next door didn't do it, then what would be the advantage of investing in environmental or ecological change if we didn't have a partner nearby? Their pollution would simply be ours. And so people began to think about this notion of global that's different than some others, in which what are those levels of risk and exchange that cannot be moderated by a single nation state, but can only be done collaboratively through shared assumptions and values and exchange. And so the idea got proposed, well, what about doing this for tobacco? And does tobacco appropriately fit the criteria of something in which there are those kinds of exchange? Or if you're a tobacco industry executive, you say it's really up to every nation to decide how it wants to regulate tobacco. There's no characteristic exchange. But one of the things we found was if one country's advertising and the next one's not, that advertising bleeds immediately to nearby neighbors, and even more so in an age of the internet and digital communications. If one country raises its taxes, but nearby countries don't, then there are black markets where there's smuggling of tobacco. And one of the things we know is that the tobacco industry has been deeply implicated in smuggling tobacco from high tax to low tax areas. So there were some strong arguments for thinking about the movement of the risk of tobacco in an analogous way to thinking about changes in the environment. And that became the underpinnings of developing this framework convention on tobacco control. This slide's too dense, but let me just tell you what some of the key aspects of the framework convention, which the World Health Organization approved in 2005, 2006. There would be controls on lobbying. They would ask countries participating to raise their taxes to minimal levels on tobacco. They would have rules about secondhand smoke and the control of smoking in public places. They would force companies to be transparent about the ingredients in tobacco cross-nationally, that there would be higher expectations about labeling, that there would be programs for cessation, programs to control sales to minors. And so they took what were the key building blocks of all national tobacco control policies, but said we'll share these at a floor level and urge all countries to come up to these minimal levels and then increase them as we go. And this is the way framework conventions work. They have a series of protocols. The protocols are discussed by the parties. They're commonly agreed to. And then the idea is that they continue to change with time as these policies develop in specific national contexts. So the World Health Organization approved at its General Assembly this framework convention on tobacco control. It was developed by two very brilliant theorists in public health law, Alan Taylor and Ruth Romer, who's a kind of heroic figure in the history of American public health law. And it was developed with the support of Gro Brundtland, who was the Director General of the World Health Organization, and a kind of crack team of creative analysts and public health policy people at the World Health Organization. One of them was Derek Yock, who was a young physician who had developed a fabulous tobacco control program in South Africa. He's South African, and had gone to the World Health Organization and worked on developing and promulgating the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. And Yock, I think, is a particularly important figure because he and some other people were theorists about the use of law, about the nature of civil societies, about rethinking global governance and what kinds of structures might go across nations as opposed to thinking about national regulatory or governance structures. So I always have felt that Yock was a pivotal figure in selling this to Brundtland and moving it through the World Health Assembly. Today, nearly 170 countries have signed and ratified the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. The only major developed power that has not ratified the treaty is the United States. And one of the questions that I think should be put, it was put to George Bush too, and now should be put to the Obama administration, is why have you not advanced the tobacco control protocols and framework convention to the U.S. Senate for ratification. And I think we know the reasons because the tobacco companies remain enormously strong. These are some of the health warnings that were on cigarette packages. And what I'm partially arguing is they developed strong consensual notions that pushed one country and then pushed another country. So these were in Brazil. The United States had very weak labeling. The Canadians developed very strong labeling, and this has promoted Latin American countries and others to develop strong labeling. This was sort of interesting. I was in Montreal 2 summers ago, and I was in a pharmacy, and I said, I'd like a pack of cigarettes with the cigarettes cause mouth diseases label. And the pharmacist thought I was a nut because people had been trading that back for a less offensive label when these first went into effect. And as you may know, the United States labels have not changed since 1986. There's been no major piece of U.S. tobacco legislation until 2 years ago, the new FDA regulations of tobacco. And these are the new labels that will begin to appear on American cigarette packages beginning next year. And I think there are some things in the American tobacco control arsenal that should be applied globally. At the same time, this is an instance where some of the things that we've learned from developing countries and other countries with much more aggressive labeling could have a very salutary impact on smoking rates in the U.S. And you can see there are about 11 of these. They're all pretty dramatic. They're going to cover a major part of the tobacco package next year. One of the things we know about labeling is it wears out. So by not changing the label since 1986, it's been definitely demonstrated by public health experts. It has no impact in the United States right now. So most people don't see the labels. They don't know what they say. And these will have an impact. Now, I want to take up just briefly the tobacco industry's position on the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. I'm sorry to give you such a prose-heavy slide, but this is what an advisor to Philip Morris had to say. Philip Morris should be unapologetic about its advertising and promotion activity in the third world. There's something patronizing about the World Health Organization approach to smoking and health in the third world. WHO assumes that people must be saved from demon tobacco by their governments, that they can't be trusted to make personal decisions about whether or not to smoke. People in the West, despite increased government interventions, make these decisions all the time, and third world leaders generally resent the implication that they and their people must be protected. And this has been a crucial trope in tobacco industry ideology going well back, that people should make their own decisions, and why should governments intercede in an individual decision about risk-taking, and that really that's what makes markets great. There are a lot of risks out there, and individuals should make up their own mind. And this was seen as do-gooding. The terminology, for example, that many of you have heard about, health Nazis, that's just not a term that was made up. That was a term invented in tobacco industry boardrooms, and then they have public relations experts that help promote that kind of view of public regulatory interventions. This is a philosopher who was writing in the Wall Street Journal in Europe, a well-known British philosopher, public intellectual. This is not to say that tobacco is harmless or that the trade in it is a good thing. It is to say rather that where the risk of a product falls entirely on consumers and is fully explained to them, it cannot be the business of unelected bureaucrats to forbid or control it. If we lose sight of this principle, then we lose sight of the truth on which all free societies depend, namely that freedom and risk are inextricable, and whoever assumes the right to save me from risks is also assuming the right to limit my freedom. This is a very powerful view, very sharply articulated in the context of the Framework Convention. Here's Scruton again. By a semantic trick, therefore, Mrs. Brundtland and her team have been able to classify as a dangerous disease what is, in fact, a voluntary activity and a source of pleasure, the risk of which falls entirely on the smoker. Actually, that's not true. It's been shown by the World Health Organization that 60% of all children in the developing world live in a house with a regular smoker. And we now know that those are additional aspects of the burden of disease. By the same reasoning, we could link deaths from driving, drinking, and junk food to epidemics, and this is one of the things that we think about when we define what an epidemic is, and put cars, alcohol, and McDonald's on the WHO's agenda. And I can assure you, cars, alcohol, and McDonald's are on the WHO's agenda. But this was very interesting. It came to light by an email from Scruton's wife that actually Scruton was in the employ of Japan Tobacco, one of the major producers of global tobacco. And she wrote, in light of this, we were wondering whether you would consider putting up the fee from £4,500 monthly to £5,500 on the assumption that we try our hardest to justify this amount and that you have the right to revise it downwards if dissatisfied. We think we give good value for money in a business largely conducted by shysters and sharks, but you may not agree with this. So this is a really important kind of document because in a way you could say there's a big philosophical debate about smoking. Is it an individual behavior or should it be publicly regulated in some governance structures? But part of this argument that's so powerful and broadcast so effectively has actually been broadcast by the industry itself. So in one sense you'd think, well, those are philosophical or ethical arguments about the character of tobacco. But really, it's an argument that has been articulated and broadcast by the actual industrial interests that it supports. And there are many instances of this. And partly what I want to suggest is this is Bernays 2. The industry became very acutely aware that it had a public relations issues that it could deal with very effectively behind the scenes. And by sponsoring articles in prominent magazines like the Wall Street Journal Europe, it gets its views out there into the political sphere in ways that will affect policy outcomes. They hire firms like this, Montgovin, Biscoe, and Dushin, and they were advising Philip Morris about how to undermine the Framework Convention. So here it says, examination of the draft text will help Philip Morris anticipate the potential protocols that the Framework Convention will create. The history of Framework Convention shows that successful weakening of the language of an article in a Framework Convention can be easily undermined in the protocol process. The potential protocols are more important to the company in the long term than the Framework Convention itself. So what does Philip Morris say? Oh, we support the Framework Convention. We think that's a great idea because they know that the best place to intervene. Now, how do they intervene? They want there to be citizens that get to participate in the protocol-making, party-arguing process. And very often those are people who have had ties to the tobacco industry. So they're very strategic approaches to undermining these protocols. Aside from delaying the adoption of the convention, the company is best served by participating in the development of the agreement, which is what they did. It would be in the company's best interest to have the treaty focus entirely on protecting children and leaving adult choice protected. So this is the activity of global health in sometimes its most nefarious way. Here's the chairman of British American Tobacco. The Framework Convention is a developed world obsession being foisted on the developing world. And on and on. I don't want to take too much time with this. One of the strategies they had was spend more time talking about AIDS, develop AIDS media, which will distract from tobacco as a public health problem. Here's British American Tobacco again. A clumsy pursuit of global standards can become a form of moral and cultural imperialism based on assumptions that West is best. Imposing Western priorities or global solutions that force the values and priorities of any one country on another can become a new form of colonialism. So here you have companies that are imposing tremendous burden of disease, then defining the regulatory process as but a new form of colonialism. And I think, what's concerning about this is how powerful and potentially effective these kinds of arguments can be to countries without strong state orientations or regulatory regimes. These are the kinds of things that Philip Morris is doing now in the U.S., and I explained that I consider the U.S. part of this global mix. They say we're supporting, youth smoking restrictions. Here's what to do if your child is smoking. It's become very clear in public health that the biggest single risk for kids are if their parents smoke, but there's nothing in these pamphlets about that relationship and the idea that parents might quit if you decide to quit smoking. So these are very effective. They use these in the types of trials that I testified in. They say no one's more committed to, if somebody wants to quit, than Philip Morris to helping them get what they need to quit. So these become very effective public relations tools, even though they're shown from the kinds of science of public health assessment that they don't actually assist people in quitting. If Philip Morris is helping you quit cigarettes, you're in very big trouble. When they got rid of Joe Camel, they started Camel number 9 with these pink packages, obviously with the idea that they would especially appeal to women. These are being sold globally now. Here was one thing I just wanted to mention. You know, I told you Derek Yock was kind of a hero of mine, and I think he's one of the great thinkers. I asked the class to read 2 of his papers that were very influential to me. So Derek Yock left World Health Organization, went to Yale School of Public Health, where he taught and had a decanal role. And then he left Yale School of Public Health, and I started looking, where's Derek Yock today? And some of you may know, he went to PepsiCo, where he became their principal vice president for global relations. And here he is pictured in the center as senior vice president for global health policy at PepsiCo. And I sort of invite you to go on the PepsiCo website, because PepsiCo in the beverage industry has learned a lot from the tobacco industry about how to promote products that are very high in sugars around the world. And so what they've done is introduced a range of products, knowing that their sugared products are their most popular, most aggressively advertised, and most highly sold. But by introducing a range of safer and less risky products, they then say, don't regulate sugared sodas because we are leaving this up to consumer choice and we're providing much less risky products in the marketplace. And that's exactly what PepsiCo has done. And I have to say, I don't blame this on Derek Yock, but it was a real disappointment to lose his intelligence from public health to now really advising PepsiCo about how to orient themselves in a global market. So this is from the PepsiCo website. I just pulled this off the other day. Today, whether it's Quaker oatmeal or Lay's potato chips, consumers around the world can choose products that are right for them and good for their families. Choices like these, along with active lifestyles, make it easier for consumers to enjoy the foods they like and achieve the energy balance they need to lead active lifestyles. And so I have to say, I don't think I would have noticed this reading this, but having spent so much time following the logic of the tobacco industry argument, I think you can see there's a very powerful set of relationships in thinking about the global market, the idea of freedom of choice, the idea of opening trade, the idea that risk is really can only be assessed by individual consumers and should not be regulated by governments. So here are people smoking around the world. This is really the problem, and I'll end here, is that if consumption just remains constant as to what it is today, 1 billion people will die of tobacco-related diseases worldwide in the 21st century. 100 million died worldwide in the 20th century. So we will increase tobacco deaths, even if consumption only stayed right where it is, by a factor of 10 in the 21st century, 1 billion people. And if you could moderate tobacco even somewhat, you could reduce these figures. But it's very hard, given the long time lags, tobacco, and the difficulties of cessation, to really reduce this market. So it will involve much more creative strategies about governance and regulation than we currently have if we want to impact a problem as insidious, in which there are such powerful industrial interests continuing to promote the product as there are in tobacco. This is a child in Serbia. On your left are monks in Cambodia, a tobacco salesman in Jakarta, Indonesia. On your right are street children in Shanghai. On your left is a little boy, and actually there's a story about this, named Sergei Myrov. And this was taken by a Pulitzer Prize-winning photographer in St. Petersburg in 1993, and the little boy was just 8 years old at the time. And he told John Kaplan, the photographer, I only smoke Marlboro cigarettes. So what does this mean to me? It means that given the dimensions of the problem, we need to have far more creative and robust strategies of global governance than we have. I actually find myself quite hopeful about a phenomena like the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, even though I'm prepared to recognize how weak it is in relationships to the resources that will be brought to bear by the industry. But if nations can participate as civil societies collaborating and recognizing the threat that's posed by certain kinds of trade, commerce, and industrial interests, then at least we have the beginnings of some strategies that we need to think much more about. I actually think that historians, anthropologists, sociologists, epidemiologists, there are many fields represented here, will really need to collaborate much more consistently than we have in the past if we're going to come up with the kinds of things that really contribute to change around issues like tobacco. So thank you very much.
Yes, thank you again, Allan. And if you have questions, I'm sure you will, please come up to the microphone. Allan, I have to say that it was really, amazing demonstration of how you can use history to look ahead and see it differently. And at the same time, weave in this common concern of ours about the idea of global governance. One of the critiques for those who speak about global governance is this question of accountability. And it does seem that the tobacco industry is playing on that idea. Who elected Grow Brundtland, right? And who is it who's really behind these advocacy networks and so on? So, what do you say to this idea that those who are purporting to serve people in poor countries by protecting them from the export of American cigarettes, who do they answer to, and why is it that we should allow them to set the agenda for all of us?
Right. The thing about complex governance structures like framework conventions is that in the end, it has to be consistent with national political democratic processes. So even though the protocols can, in a sense, require countries to come up to these standards, it's really a consensual standard that then has to be it has to be supported through the internal state regulatory processes. So it's not as if the Framework Convention can decide everybody's going to label cigarettes in this way, and then that actually puts the labels on the cigarettes. What the framework does is it sets a standard that then the political processes will be held accountable to. So in a sense, that's the weakness of the Framework Convention, is that it invents standards that will not necessarily be fulfilled through all parties to the convention. And I think that's acceptable. The question is, it seems so ironic for the industry to say, but who's accountable to tobacco activists? Because we actually understand the accountability of industrial interests very well. Industries are accountable exclusively to their shareholders. So to say that shareholders have a greater stake in public health processes than these other forms of formal and informal governance mechanisms seems to me to be somewhat hypocritical. So, it's one thing to voice the argument that choice is very important, but when you see the industry doing it as an industry, that's one thing. When you see the industry supporting those arguments as if they are independent, then I think it really undermines their authority to question accountability. So I think the industry is just incredibly sophisticated, and that's the question in a way. What are the countervailing governance structures in the face of certain kinds of capital interests that can be very detrimental to the public good?
Okay, thank you. Please.
I wanted to know, since the tobacco industry has been proved guilty, so to speak, in the U.S., why isn't it a slam dunk for other countries to sue them and get a lot of money?
it's a really good question. And unfortunately, even despite the success of the American tobacco suits, most of the funds that were collected, for example, by the state attorneys generals in their cases when the companies settled, went to other things. So rather than some of that money being dedicated to tobacco control, it went to pay debt. In North Carolina, it paid for some tobacco warehouses. It paid for the maintenance of golf courses in some states. And so it turned out to be incredibly unfortunate. $240 billion collected by the collective state attorneys general that now, merely funds, day-to-day operations in the state. And you see, the companies really understood that, and they said, we can get rid of these suits. The monies won't go to tobacco control. So it's, again, very sophisticated. But the question is, where does liability fit in a global strategy? And there are some countries where it will actually be quite viable. There are some Latin American countries where there are some very promising litigations against the tobacco industry. But it really has to do with individual judicial structures. And in the United States, we've always had a relatively low threshold for civil litigation, which is one of the really great democratic aspects of the American court system, is that if you had a legitimate complaint, you could bring it against a company at relatively low cost and get into the courts. There are other places like the United Kingdom where it's almost impossible to enter the courts on a tort. So there are these individual structures, and I think when we're doing comparative global work, you would really want to understand better, where are the places where there are opportunities for tobacco liability litigation to succeed? Where is that likely to be secondary? What kinds of legal remedies could you pursue in the face of a failure of torts and other things? So it's a very good question, because how can the courts be used more effectively? There's a lot of people who sort of think that in the U.S. the liability phase is over. I'm less clear about that. I think there are some very creative strategies, and we may see some of these strategies move to other products. Everyone laughed when some kids sued McDonald's on issues of the health of their foods, how transparent the calories and fat content were. But what you did see is McDonald's, in their corporate structure, responding to that very quickly in some positive ways by developing changes in their menu, greater transparency in their nutritional identification. So litigation, I think, sometimes forces better public health practice, and it's one of those threats. How could we use it more effectively, even if you're going to fail? I watched the tobacco litigation fail and fail, but it was having a tremendous impact in getting the documents out. So the history that I was able to write was dependent on litigation that had failed. And that irony really, it told a story that has been used now, I think, by myself, but many others, to effectively galvanize public health interest in regulating tobacco that wouldn't have been available without the suits. And the companies kept saying, we're winning. But as those documents began to come out, they were, in some aspects, they were losing. Yes?
Thank you very much. Some years ago, C. Edward Koop said that as soon as Americans found out that the tobacco companies had lied to them about the addictive qualities of cigarettes, they would throw their cigarette packs away and be done with the whole thing. And he said it was one of the big disappointments of his life that that's not what happened. Yeah. And that the problem of cessation was one that was actually stronger. The addictive qualities were actually stronger than he had anticipated. I'm wondering if you could tell us just a little bit about the history of tobacco cessation and how successful it is at this point.
Yes, it's a great question. And, tobacco is one of those problems that is so dynamic and multiple that the only types of policies that really will work will be across a gradient from individual patient-oriented services to strategic public communications and other regulatory interventions. And cessation is really important. And we know that some people can quit and do quit. But we also know now that for some individuals, it is enormously difficult to quit. So a quit is not a constant phenomenon. And we now understand that better. For example, people with a comorbid psychiatric condition have much more difficulty quitting. People who are not in strong social networks have a much greater difficulty quitting. So how could we address that particular population? This last 15 to 20% of Americans who are smokers, that is a residual, very difficult, addicted population that will require stronger biomedical and social interventions than we have available for them now. But there have been other issues. For example, we haven't third-party funded a lot of cessation services. We know that some of the medications that are helpful are not helpful without therapy or counseling. So there's a lot that we could do to really address these needs. I was doing a little research on smoking in mental health hospitals. It's really interesting. In the 50s and 60s, if you behaved well, they would give you cigarettes in these hospitals. So one of the rewards was actually tobacco. And there was a lot of concern. What would happen if certain mental health institutions went smoke-free? And they actually have, and I think it's a great thing, because you really don't want people exposed to, who are suffering, to be exposed to additional risks. And people can quit under the right conditions with the right support. And some of that is pharmacologic, some of it is social and cultural. So it really means putting those things together. And we could do much better, and a lot of those things will be tremendously beneficial in the developing world as their health infrastructures become stronger.
Thanks again for coming to speak.
It's a pleasure.
One of the things we have talked about this summer in the class that's associated with this lecture series is thinking critically about historical analogies. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on how we might think critically about using the tobacco case applied to fast food, as well as the example you mentioned with PepsiCo. And I was wondering what your thoughts were as well on the possibility that this might actually be to some advantage to tobacco companies going forward, in that they can point to litigation on fast food as something that is sort of similar to what they make their opponents out to be, as somebody whose response is not merited, as something that perhaps trivializes the public health threat of cigarettes.
Yes, it's a really good point, because when people sued McDonald's, the tobacco industry right away said, this is what happens when you get into a litigious society where there's always someone else to blame, where no one's really accountable for their own individual decision making. And I get asked that question a lot, like, well, am I saying that people who smoke have no responsibility and they're out of control? And I actually think the goal of health, in a way, is giving people as much autonomy as possible over the control of their health, but that would mean that you'd have to moderate some of these industrial interests. So it's a little bit of a misconception. The best thing is if people can quit, but what's the context in which they can quit? It's a regulatory context, it's a context in which the risks of the product are very clearly identified, in which there's educational and communications ideas. I've been concerned about the story of tobacco in this way. Like, on the one hand, I wanted to tell it, and I thought if I told it clearly, people would see these strategies more clearly when they were applied by other industries. I think one of the things we're finding right now is a lot of industries are studying very closely what the tobacco industry did and how they've been so successful. And they're studying in many ways. We should be looking for developing world global markets in places where the regulatory regimes are becoming more overt and aggressive, in terms of sugared beverages, for example, which are not sold in many elementary schools anymore. And it's been shown that they have an impact on child and teen obesity. We should be looking to develop worlds where there are less regulatory regimes. And we see the movement of risk globally from more highly regulated to less well-regulated places. So that's one thing. The arguments about choice and freedom of individuals to make those determinations, the arguments about individual nations should make those decisions instead of doing it consensually across nations. These are all things that were very clearly articulated in the tobacco industry documents, which became widely available. And unfortunately, I wasn't the only one using them. I think the industrial interests of similar products that have risk have been using them also. So there's been an emerging literature on sort of the tobacco playbook, as it gets called. And I think many people admire how effectively the tobacco industry responded to what was perceived in the 50s as a potential knockout blow to the industry, and how they were able to sustain themselves and be enormously profitable throughout the second half of the 20th century into the 21st century, despite marketing a product that is uniformly harmful to human beings. It is, you know, I mean, I have to say it's a remarkable, if, you know, terribly sobering story. And I think that other industries will learn from it. So, you know, those of us who are advocates for public health have to be more aggressive, creative. We have to rethink policies and strategies. And I think historians, among other fields, will have a lot to say about understanding how these structures got to be and how important they are for the overall burden of disease. So I know that doesn't completely answer your question, but please.
Hey, thank you for your speech. And I'm actually not sure whether you are the right person for me to ask this question, but I just want to have a try. I was thinking maybe it would be an effective policy for Chinese government to tie up cigarette smoking with deduction in their medical bills. So if they smoke, they will not get government subsidy on their medical bill. So my question is, I wanted to know whether the current medicine or technology is very sensitive to early stage smoking. Because, yeah, I see those pictures when it's very serious. You can see the lungs are not okay,
Yes.
but I wonder whether they can detect when it's very in the early stage.
Yes. It's getting easier and better to detect lung cancer, for example, sooner. There are biochemical assays that can show who's smoking and who's not. But I have to say my own perspective has been not to restrict health services for smokers. And that's been a prominent argument in the United States. It sort of says, because it buys into the idea that this was an individual risk and therefore the smoker should be responsible for what he or she did in terms of smoking. And the way I see smoking is that it's a behavior that's been motivated by the companies. And the best way of demotivating it is regulating the industry as opposed to potentially punishing smokers. And the reason I say that is that some people, and I'm sure this is true in China, are much more vulnerable to become smokers than other people. They tend to be less well educated, they tend to be of lower socioeconomic status, and the companies know that their advertising is most likely to appeal to these target groups. They tend to be young people. And so what happens with most smokers is, in the United States, for example, is most people who become smokers today started when they were 14 or 15 years old, sometimes younger. And then by the time they get to be 30, they're going to have a lot of trouble quitting. And if they're not in a good social network that has promoted quitting, it'll be even harder. And then they'll get sick and they'll say, well, we don't give health services to people who smoked, even though the industry knew that the only place it was going to get smokers was in children who couldn't make, you know, deeply informed, educated decisions. So I think the best policies are the ones that focus on restrictions of the product, as opposed to sort of saying, we won't provide health services, because by then it's too late. And what you really want to do is have interventions that break the chain of tobacco commerce at an earlier point in time. Taxes are very effective. So high taxes on tobacco have been shown to radically decrease tobacco consumption.
Well, I agree with you that dealing with the providing of tobacco is a good strategy. However, since those developing world had already collapsed in terms of tariffs against American tobacco products, I think if China right now to increase the tariff against American tobacco products, I think it might be difficult.
It probably would be, although in China, you know, most of the tobacco smoked in China continues to be produced by the Chinese government. And this has been one of the problems in a lot of developing world countries. I didn't have enough chance to say about it, is that these tobacco monopolies sold a lot of tobacco, especially the Chinese monopoly, which was actually started by the British American Tobacco Company, talked about colonialism in the 1880s and 1890s, and then Mao seized the British American tobacco factories and made them the Chinese national tobacco monopoly during the Chinese Revolution. But those companies get a lot of revenue for other functions of the government. So there are strategies within those governments of sort of saying, and I think this is happening in the Chinese government right now, is sort of saying, you know, we're creating a lot of disability that we will have health responsibilities for, so maybe we have to rethink the balance between promoting tobacco, which has been a revenue producer for the government, and beginning to restrict it. But one of the things that happens is when the tariffs are lower, when there is competition from abroad, the monopolies become much more effective. So they begin to modernize their machinery, they begin to advertise more. So one of the things is, like, the World Bank was against monopolies because they found them economically inefficient in a global trade. But tobacco monopolies actually restricted the profusion of tobacco in important ways. But I'm much more for acting on that production side than on the side of the individual smoker.
Okay.
Scott, yeah, sorry I have to cut off discussion, but it's just that we were running a
I'll be
little
around
late.
for a bit, so we can take it up.
Okay, go ahead.
Thank you very much. That was a fantastic talk. My PhD work is actually in Indonesia, and I see a huge number of primarily males smoking in Indonesia. I find it fascinating. There's, I think, some surveys have put it upwards of 70 or 80% of males. Yeah. And it's deeply ingrained within, it's intergenerational. As you have pictures, children are smoking, primarily boys, and it goes into teenagers. Some of the groups that I work with, if you don't smoke as a male, you're called a waria, which is a transgender individual, and it's a stigmatizing term, of course, in many cultures, in many parts of Indonesia. And I'm wondering if any public health interventions have aimed at breaking down and uprooting those norms, those sense of masculinity and femininity. And I'm wondering if there's anything outside of litigation or financial incentives, pressures, taxes. Is there any way in which those can be uprooted? And is there any examples in the US or anywhere else of those programs?
Yeah, this is a really great question because, partly what I've been talking about is global, and it's complicated for us because on the one hand, I think what I'm arguing is we need to take a global perspective on problems like this, and yet at the same time, I think we really need to understand these very intricate local meanings of cigarettes if you were to develop a whole tobacco control program. And there certainly are, I spoke to a group of teenagers in New York City about 8 or 9 years ago, and one of the students came up to me afterwards and he sort of said, I didn't have any friends. He was 15. He said, I didn't have any friends till I started smoking. Now I have so many friends. And I know I should stop, but, I built my friends, around beginning to smoke. And that's what we do. We smoke. And I know it's not good for me. And it gave me some notion that it's very easy for us to see this as a bad behavior without any social rewards. But in certain cultures, in certain subcultures, there can be very significant benefits to this. And to not understand that precludes some of the interventions that might help us undo it. I mean, one of the things I've noticed in American tobacco control initiatives is among adolescents, making the industry the villain is much more effective than sort of saying you're doing something bad. And so there's been some very effective local teen and kid campaigns that really emphasize they're manipulating us. And so I think, those psychologies are not universal. So you really need to understand in a culture, such as Indonesia, how is this working? And is there some way of uncoupling the cultural connections that it currently makes and the meanings that it has? And I watched the meaning of cigarette smoking change in the United States, from everyone doing it in film to people apologizing for doing it, for people feeling ashamed about doing it. I don't see those as bad things, but if we understood those processes, are there ways to engineer them in some ways? And I think that, that's why we really need very creative ethnographic and culturally specific work to understand how smoking functions in a different culture, even though the product seems universal and globally branded as it's put now.
So I think that was a great question. I really appreciate that answer as well. Fantastic talk. I kind of want to probe you more on the issue of stigmatization of the smoker versus stigmatization of the industry.
Yeah.
And, there was the exchange that you had mentioned between Scott Burris and Ron Bayer in terms of whether we should use stigma at all as a tool against individual smokers when it is an addictive problem and the industry is, so involved with promoting this unhealthy activity.
Right.
So I'm wondering just if you could kind of expound upon your ethical views in terms of what is appropriate and given the history of the role of industry.
Yeah. I mean, I think that there's a progression to these things. So, for example, we could take outdoor bans as just one example. Like, I wouldn't have started with outdoor bans or bans on Jones Beach or something like that. But I'm not adverse to that now. And, I was walking through the Columbia campus, which I walked through thousands of times as a student. What if smoking was banned in the main quadrangle of the Columbia campus here on 116th Street? What would be the implications of that? It's a very interesting kind of thought experiment. What if there were just signs as you enter those gates that say, smoking is not allowed, within the gated historic part of the Columbia campus? It wouldn't say you couldn't smoke on Amsterdam Ave, but, just in that space. And I actually think that's a pretty good public health intervention. Now, is it stigmatizing? A lot of people visit Columbia from all over the world. It says Columbia cares about health, that within this enclosed outside space, we don't permit smoking, and there would be, places where you could put a cigarette out as you enter that space. Now, is it like that?
The main campus, there are particular buildings outside where you can smoke,
Yes.
but not in the...
You can't smoke there. That's great. Yeah, I mean, I've seen some very effective anti-smoking bans. Are they stigmatizing? I think at one time, like, the bans were stigmatizing. I noticed, for example, that nurses hadn't quit in many healthcare institutions, but the doctors had. And the doctors would come out, and a lot of nurses would be smoking by the doorways, and they would say, you really need to quit. And, I didn't think that was such a great thing. But I wonder, like, spitting on New York City subways was, was prominent, became, illegal, became stigmatized. Is that necessarily, a bad thing? And is it only about health? In part it is, but in part it's about other things. But I think things that put out powerful public signals that this is at the very least, a contested and dangerous behavior, for individuals is the state acting in a public good way. So, this was the one thing that drove the companies crazy. They knew that their public choice arguments were very powerful, and they said, we're really in danger on the side stream smoke because it unseats all of our public choice. It only happens to the smoker himself, and it really undid them. And so I think where you can spread the notion that smoking's harmful to others, even if it has an edge of stigma, it's something smokers should understand, and it's something that the public should have signals about. So I'm not that sensitive. I think certain things should be stigmatized. They're harmful to self or others.
I'm sorry, I'm going to have to make this the last question. Our speaker's been speaking now for almost 4 hours, and so I'd like to give him a break.
I'm just getting started.
All right. Go ahead, Tim.
Well, first of all, I just really wanted to thank you for the very wonderful talk. But you've told us how throughout the years these tobacco companies have evolved in an almost Darwin-esque fashion to the changing factors within the environment by developing such products as light cigarettes or something like that. And in recent years, some things like the electronic cigarettes have emerged. And I was wondering, what's your opinion on the strength of the existing framework to prevent, I guess, the spread of these products?
Yeah, it's a very good and kind of sad question, because I think part of what I'm suggesting is that we've really made some substantial public health progress, and we've seen, in a relatively well-educated and affluent societies, the ability to significantly reduce smoking, and I see that as the positive side. And then I think the negative side is very significant, that The companies have understood that those markets remain significant if compromised, and that they can move to other more vulnerable markets very successfully. And it will involve strategies that we just haven't imagined yet. And it really comes into question, the character of markets and health and trade. And those are very difficult issues. And I was thinking about my talk today and sort of how aggressive it is about industry interests that spread risks. But that is going to be the contested territory of public health and population health in the 21st century. It's around generic drugs and the pharmaceutical industries. It's about essential medications. It's about risks like sugared beverages or alcoholic beverages. It's about many things. And so we're going to need more robust governance and regulatory structures if we really want to support health through societies. And I think we're at a relatively, there's a lot that we've learned, but we're at a relatively preliminary stage in building those kinds of structures. And that's part of the message, I think. So,
Okay, thank you again, Allan.
thanks,
Thank
Rob.
So together with my partner in this program, Steve Morse, who you've seen many times here up at the podium, I want to thank you all again for coming, and I hope some of you will come back again next summer for another year at the Hertog Global Strategy Initiative. So thank you, Steve, for being my partner, and thank you all.